Capitola Black Recordings presents an unabridged recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker, or A Lady of England. Chapter 16. A Weary Way. Annie felt utterly bewildered as she set forth on her hopeless errand. She was almost as little suited to finding her way in the bustling streets of London as one of the lambs taken from her native meadows might have been. She was afraid to ask her way, and still more afraid of losing it. At length she was hailed by the conductor of an omnibus which was proceeding half empty along the road. The poor girl had a vague idea that omnibuses went to the city, and partly from this notion, partly because she never knew how to say no, Annie took her place in the conveyance without ascertaining its destination. Full of her difficult mission, endeavouring in vain to frame such an address as might move the stony heart of Mr. Barnes, Annie took little notice of the road through which she passed. At length, raising her timid eyes and glancing through the opposite window, a suspicion crossed her mind that all might not be right. "I wonder if we are near the bank," she murmured almost to herself.
"The bank? Bless your heart! Why, this is Bayswater!" exclaimed a stout gentleman who was seated opposite, and pitying Annie's look of dismay, he called to the guard to stop the omnibus. Annie was so much excited and agitated as she descended from the vehicle that she could scarcely manage to find a solitary sixpence which she happened to have with her. In her flurry at starting she had quite forgotten her purse. She was so long fumbling in her pocket to find this sixpence, hidden amongst keys, pincushion, housewife, nutmeg, scraper, and bits of toys, that the guard almost lost patience at the delay. The coin was drawn forth at last, and the unhappy Annie, as the conveyance drove off, which had taken her miles out of her way, turned to recommence her long walk to the city, on which she felt to be a desperate errand. The walk seemed almost interminable, and yet, weary, frightened, bewildered as she was, Annie was less wretched than on the day when, in the bitterness of her spirit, she had poured out her griefs to the missionary. He had spoken to her of casting all her cares upon a heavenly Father, resting on his love as her beloved child rested upon her own. And this image had constantly since recurred to her mind with a comforting and soothing power. "I am as blind as my babe in spiritual things. Oh, that the Lord would lead me by the hand," was the desire that unconsciously formed itself into prayer, and with the prayer came some measure of peace to the weary and tempest-tossed soul. The short winter day was beginning to wane before Annie, pale with exhaustion, trembling with excitement, stood at length in the dreaded presence of Mr. Barnes, the man who appeared to hold in his hands the fate of her husband. Annie's tongue seemed to cleave to her mouth, and it was some moments before she could make intelligible to her stern, repulsive-looking auditor who she was, and on what errand she had come. His reply was brief, cold, decided. He was sorry that she had troubled herself by making such an application, thought that she had understood that all connection was closed between himself and Mr. Warren. He reminded her that he had her own receipt in full for the last 3 weeks' salary, and he closed by wishing that her husband might make a good recovery. Annie clasped her hands, and her silent tears would have spoken with more eloquence than words to a spirit less hard than that of Mr. Barnes. But cold and unmoved he stood, the only sign of feeling which he evinced being a sensation of relief when the door of his office had closed behind the unwelcome supplicant. "Oh, what is to be done? How shall I ever get home? What will Martin say?" exclaimed the poor young wife, as she found herself again in the bustling thoroughfare, almost distracted by the noise and bewildered by the sight of the crushing, crowding vehicles. How inexpressibly welcome at that moment was the sound of a familiar voice. "Why, surely that must be Annie Laver!" It was years since she had been called by that name, and when, hastily raising her eyes, she perceived a tall, slight young man, elegantly dressed and wearing moustaches, she scarcely recognized in him the schoolboy Maurice Somers, who had occasionally called at her mother's cottage to purchase from her fancy rabbits or poultry. "Oh, sir,
To think of your meeting me here!" The poor girl became so much agitated at seeing one who reminded her of the peaceful home of her childhood that Maurice perceived at a glance that the disobedient daughter was not the happy wife. "You look dreadfully weary and worn, Annie. Mrs. Warren, are you far from your home?"
"About 4 miles, I believe, sir,"
answered Annie, mentioning the place of her abode. "You were not thinking of walking such a distance. My cab is just round the corner. I will drive you to your house, and you shall tell me on the way how you are getting on in the world, and what message I should carry to your mother, for our return this evening to Grandmont." The relief to Annie's worn-out frame was not greater than that which her weary mind experienced, as she accepted the kindly offer. It seemed as if a friend had been sent to her at the moment when she most required one. As Maurice in his light elegant vehicle threaded the labyrinth of streets, guided with skill his spirited horse through the concourse of carts and carriages, Annie, in a few broken words, told him of the illness of her husband, and of the blindness of her son. She then, in faltering tones, asked news of her mother. "Better than she was last winter, decidedly better. Mrs. Laver goes about now and manages everything just as she did before she was ill."
"Ill!"
exclaimed Annie with a look of distress.
"I did not know that mother had been ill. Oh, who was there to nurse and take care of her?"
"The good old neighbor who lives next to the school was very attentive to her, and Mrs. Wells saw that she wanted for nothing." Maurice might have added, had he chosen to do so, that he himself carried many a little delicacy to the cottage with the ivy-mantled porch. "But you have not the slightest cause for feeling uneasiness now," he added kindly. "Mrs. Laver has completely recovered."
"How I wish that I could see her! No one could help me in my trouble as she would. Mother always knows what is best to be done."
"Do you not think that she would come to you if you asked her?"
"Perhaps,"
said Annie, mournfully and doubtfully.
"Though I have not seen her since, and I don't deserve, and I'm afraid my husband—"
"Get his consent to her coming. I'll be answerable for hers," said the young man, who knew how the mother's heart had yearned over her weak and undutiful child, and who was satisfied that any resentment which might linger there would be quenched by the knowledge that her daughter was sad and suffering, sought her forgiveness, and needed her aid. Maurice then tried to divert Annie's thoughts from her own trials by such little pieces of intelligence from her native village as were likely to interest his companion. He told her of the new organ and various improvements in the church, and of the playground just opened near the school. He informed her of who died and who had married, all of which intelligence was perfectly new to Annie, for neither she nor her mother were scribes, and they had not met since her unfortunate marriage. Then Annie heard how Sir John was troubled with the gout and seldom visited London, how Mr. Glidden, a cousin from India, had been for some weeks a guest at Grandmont, and so the time passed rapidly away, and Annie found herself, before she was aware, at the gate of her little garden.
"If you would honor me, sir, by walking in,"
she said, after simply expressing her thanks to Maurice Summers. "I fear that I must decline your kindness. I should feel myself an intruder in a house of sickness, and besides, it will soon be growing dark, and I have a long drive before me." Raising his hat courteously to the daughter of the humble cottager, the young heir of Grandmont shook his reins, his splendid horse bounded forward, and the elegant cabriolet was soon out of sight, whirling rapidly towards the south of London. Thank you for listening to Capitola Black Recordings. I hope you have enjoyed this recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker.